Econ 101? Yeah? Alright. So, what I want to do is I'm going to talk first and foremost and kind of discuss how to think about the economy in terms of debate, and then we will work into constructing advantages and disadvantages with specific economic focuses, and we'll go over that. So the first thing I want to give is just a real quick overview. So when you think about the economy, a lot of the times we think about it in, and it's talked about in debate, in really a temporal notion, like what is happening now, which is probably not a good way to conceive of it. You should conceive of the economy the same way that economists conceive of it, which is trends. There are overarching market trends that point in one direction. Because even if you have, so you have, like, let's say you have growth in, that looks like this, that, even though there are points of downturn, the overall trend is up. This is a term that statisticians call riding the down, or going down the up escalator, which it's also, if you follow climate change, it's a similar term, because you see the climate rise, fall, rise, fall, rise, fall, but always rising. The climate change deniers will say, look, the temperature between those 7 years fell. That's why you don't look at, things like science that way, because looking at science in just this very small notion of time doesn't give you the overarching trend. Same thing is true about economics. If you conceive of it in too small of a time period, then you're not getting positive information. So it's important for you to think about the economy in terms of trends rather than what does it look like right now. So how do you start to do that? Well, the first thing that you can do is you can go to places that literally track the trends of the economy for you. Let me pull this down and show you a few websites. View. So the first one that I recommend is every, I think 3 to 4 months. I can't remember if it's quarterly or triannually. The University of Michigan releases an economic outlook, and it is pretty badass. It is only actually 2 pages, but describes the overarching trends of the economy. And these types of documents that the University of Michigan releases, the Federal Reserve also releases one. They release one actually the last Friday of every month. It's called the Beige Book, and it gives out the trends for the entire country overall. That is quite a bit bigger, so that one you really have to learn how to pick out things, but that's a little ahead of our time. But this one is a great, absolutely fantastic intro trend piece, because it does a really good job. University of Michigan absolutely kills it. In terms of some of the more date-to-date specifics, or to get some government data on this, the 2 places you can go is obviously the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics gives you the overarching, like, how things ran for the last few months in terms of costs. And this gives you more of a short-term, not too short of a term, but more of a short-term idea of the general market trends, which is important because if you are making arguments on the affirmative about how you need to have an economic growth now, you probably want to have short-term reasons as to why that's true. You would want to know that because that's the way you can, short-circuit disads on time frame, is by saying the economy is in trouble in the short term. Maybe not medium and long terms we're facing so much trouble, but we have choppy waters ahead of us now. And so you might want to go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which gives you a whole bunch of major economic indicators. Do you all know what the Consumer Price Index is also known as? Yeah, it's a term that you would all have heard before. Inflation. It refers to the rate in which prices are rising. And obviously, if inflation is rising quickly, that is a bad sign for the economy. It tends to be a sign that an economy is overheating. we are very fortunate right now that there's so much global deflationary pressure, which is not fortunate, I guess inflation is fortunate because there's so much global deflationary pressure that it's very difficult for inflation to rise even though we're printing money. The other one that's really interesting is the employment cost index, which is how much it will cost to add one more employee, which is a good statistic to know if you're trying to make an argument about is hiring going to increase or decrease in the future. You can look right here that, compensation costs up 0.5% from March to July 2013 is not particularly bad considering it's way under last year's cost for an employee. So you can infer from that no, you say the economy's doing poorly, we say, actually the economy's doing quite well because the cost for employers to hire more people is down, which means that hiring can only go up because you get more bang for your buck, because that's how businesses think, right? It's all about a question of purchases and returns. They expect a certain amount of return from hiring another employee. If the cost to hire employees is down, then subsequently there is less of a risk to buying a new employee because that amount of production that you're expected to get has less of a cost to it. Did that make sense to everyone, or did that make sense to no one? Make sense? Okay. Right? Cool. So that's why you might want to learn some of these economic indicators. And then the United States Census Bureau actually gives you some pretty sweet industry-specific stuff, like manufacturing, construction, housing. You can actually go here to things like the industry snapshots, and it just basically gives you a real quick idea of how everything's working, from mining to utilities. And so if you want to write really specific disads, or you want to get good on having a few really tight answers to economy disads, then you can use these types of things and defend it. So for example, let's look at arts, entertainment, and recreation. How's it doing? Go to industry snapshot of the performing arts. Come on, where is it? Go, take me there. Take me there. Well, it's the census. There we go. So you can see where performing arts is doing quite well, as in revenue per capita. So you can see, oddly enough, places like the Heartland are just killing it in terms of per capita. Although that is probably because of sporting events. And a significant lack of people. That's also who would give a shit about sport. I don't think you're going to run a sporting events. But you can see, what you can see here overall is this statistic right here, receipts per employee. So what that means, you can interpret that statistic a couple of different ways. Either you can interpret it as they are making more money because they're charging higher prices, or they're making more money because they're cutting employees, or potentially both. But what that tends to mean is when you see something rise like that, is they're finding more and more of a reason not to have people work there. And a great example of this would be automated ticket takers at movie theaters. How many of you have gone to the movies and seen the place where you can just go buy tickets with a credit card? Yeah, those are going to be the wave of the future. You're not going to have people buy your tickets anymore. You're not going to buy tickets from people anymore. It's too expensive.
So if it's going up, that means they're hiring less people?
That tends to mean that they're hiring less people because the amount of receipts is outpacing the amount of hiring of employees.
Okay.
So especially at a rate like that, where you see in 10 years it's increased quite significantly, almost a good, 45%. That's a pretty big jump for just 10 years. It should not have gone up that much. You can look at the relative employment. They've increased less than 100,000 jobs for total employment for this, but they've increased the number of establishments by over 13,000. So they're not hiring as many people. especially since their annual payroll. This is the other thing, you can compare their annual payroll to receipts revenues, and you can see there is quite a bit. There is an expansive change, 33.4 to 33.1 in the amount of payroll. But you can see in specifically the last 5 years, the amount of payroll has quite significantly jumped from 20,000, a little over 20,000 to just 6 more thousand people, versus this jump, which was a little bit less and a little bit more. So they're hiring less and less. Cool? Okay, so that's how you can, so that's some blank. So that is just general economic trends. So follow and understand economic trends, because that's how you should think about them. The next thing that you should think about is not talking about saying the economy is up or the economy is down. That type of overarching broadness is not only bad, but really misses some of the nuance that's necessary in debate. So you should think about it in terms of sectors. What sector of the economy is doing well? These are things like housing, well, not the, what sector of the economies exist? Housing, construction, agriculture, and even within all of these, there are, more and more sectors, because there's not just housing. There's, large homes, single-family homes, rentals, mobile homes, manufactured homes. There's a whole bunch of different overarching market trends that have to go into it. But that's a little too specific for, I think, debate, unless it's a very, very tight dissent, or it's maybe the NPT, where you might have a very specific, very well worked out dissent that goes super deep into the economy. But if you start getting into just general sectors, you're probably okay. So think about the economy in terms of what type of sectors are functioning, or rather than, and parametricize what you're talking about too. It allows you to get more specific. For example, if a team is passing, let's say that the resolution is the United States federal government should significantly increase regulations on what am I trying to say here? The United States should increase regulations on banks, on mortgage banks. So like they increase regulations for documentation or for income filing, for things like that, things that are important in buying a home. You might want to run not an econ disad, but a housing market disad. Here is the general direction of the housing market. Here is why the housing market is doing well. Links. Here is why your plan prevents the continuation of the trend we have highlighted. Here is why that's true. Here is the new trend. Here is why that's bad. You might want to be more specific like that. But you can even get and it's good to next think about it outside of sectors than to time frames. Because this is how they think about it when people make investments, when people choose to hire new people. They think about it in short, medium, and long term. So when you talk about decisions, and this may not be super important in terms of the shell, but these are important things to know for answers to things. For example, if you are on the opposition and the other team is really going for an econ argument to answer your politics dissent, the answer that people have finally caught on to is the solvency for your advantage doesn't really reach the economy till the medium or the long term, which means that you wouldn't consider it as a reason for why politicians wouldn't vote a certain way, because they wouldn't experience that success till after they would have voted, or till after this decision would have been made, right? So that's why you need to understand and think about things in this type of time frame, because you can utilize the time frame of different economic questions to answer disads or to answer AFs. You would need those types of things to be able to get at stuff, because being able to articulate the short-term effects on the housing market in relation to longer term effects on regulation is a way that you can win that debate, even though you are facing what is in general a good idea. Making stricter regulations on mortgages is probably a good fucking idea. But you can articulate reasons as to why that's not good by knowing specific trends in the housing market, articulating the short-term problems that might come from bucking that trend, and then have reasons as to why short-term problems lead to bigger problems for the housing market. And this may be, for example, the bubble. When there are short-term derailments in what is otherwise a successful market, there are perpetually questions by investors and by buyers if the market has really healed all of the way. So having a short-term downturn in the housing market is bad because the housing market is at a critical recovery point. So being able to articulate those types of things allows you to not only have a better understanding of the economy, which means you're better at articulating it in the debate and it doesn't sound so generic, but it's actually very important when actually debating because you need to use this type of time frame to leverage offense against affirmatives or against disads or counterplans. Does that make sense? Okay. Next, when you talk about things like, one of the important things when you talk about it in the economy is a question of perception. And we argue things like confidence, right? And you've heard, so there's these measures of confidence. And you've heard consumer, business, and investor, probably. You've heard those three, maybe others. Has anybody heard any others outside of those three? Well, these also these are not monoliths. There's no way you can consider that. And no economist, no person in business would consider them as monoliths. You have consumers with different needs. You have consumers who are the impoverished. There are the overwhelming majority of consumer spending is done by the middle and working class. So what are their needs and what are their spending habits allows you to better gauge what their consumer confidence is or what their consumer confidence means. For example, if consumer confidence is high, especially among the working class and impoverished, that probably means that general economic spending is expected to increase in the near future because economic trends show us that people who are impoverished or people who are working in middle class don't save money. They don't have the ability, they increasingly less and less have the ability to save money. So their spending to earnings ratio is much closer to 100%. So what that means is that if you are trying to make an argument that we need more consumer spending and we need more consumer spending now, you might want to have an affirmative that directly increases the amount of disposable income for middle class and working class workers because they're immediately going to take that $600 so and spend it because they have to, because it is a necessity for them. So if you think about consumers that way, you can think about these questions of confidence in ways that are much more important than just this general term. Consumer confidence is at X level. Well, why is consumer confidence at X level? What does that mean? What can we do with that? Because just because it's at a high level doesn't mean the economy is doing well. Just until last month, consumer confidence was at a 6-month high, and we're still at 7.4% unemployment. Like, it hasn't gone down that much. So consumer confidence may be up, but why is consumer confidence up, and whose confidence is up? Yes?
Is there an interesting way, like those websites you're showing us to gauge how consumer confidence is right now? Or like some
There are actual measures. The University of Michigan puts out an actual consumer confidence measure. They also, and so do others, break it down into where it's being felt regionally, which is a whole nother ball of wax that we could talk about, because you got to remember economies function very regionally because our country is enormous. Like, I think sometimes people forget that we are, the 4th largest country in the world? I mean, just a massive area, and it's difficult to have trade all the way across and make that be a successful part of your economy. I mean, regional economies are just as important. So we talked about that forever as well. But what was your question? Shit. Oh yeah, they have consumer confidence indexes that has it by region and by general income level. Yeah. I don't think they break it down any further than that in terms of demographics, but region and income level.
Aaron. Okay.
So that is why it's important, because again, just like consumers are not a monolith, businesses are not a monolith. There are plans that are good for smaller businesses, just like there are things that are good for larger businesses. So when someone says, you hurt business confidence, and they're that generic, it is the easiest thing in the world for you and the member of government to come up and say, yes, we affect this larger business confidence will be affected because they will be the ones hurt by resolutions and hurt by these regulations, but they won't be affected. Here's why that doesn't matter, and here's why it's actually a confidence booster for smaller businesses. For example, if you were to place regulations on Walmart that mandated that they had to, increase their coverage for employees because they're siphoning off state funds, yes, that's bad for Walmart and Target and all the others that do that. It's bad for their business confidence, assuredly. But all of the smaller stores that have to compete with Target because they run a smaller shop, have higher overheads, and are a niche type of store, their confidence goes up. Because now they're significantly more price competitive with Target and Walmart, because Target is going to have to, and Walmart have to raise their prices to pay for increased labor costs. So you can, whenever someone says you hurt business confidence, admit that you hurt someone's business confidence, tell them why that doesn't matter, and then say, but the inverse is all of the competitors of these businesses, their confidence goes up because one of their competitors is now hampered or now has increased costs somewhere down the line. So don't ever think of consumer confidence being high or business confidence being high or something like that. Don't run those types of dissets, be more specific, but when people run those types of things on you, use that type of nuance to explain their story away. Because it is incredibly easy for you to say, no, all of your arguments indicate that business confidence is high for large corporations. Who gives a shit if their business confidence is high? They're going to make money anyways. They have a whole bunch of extra tools that allow them to stay afloat. That is certainly not the case about much smaller businesses who are not chains, who have one store. They either stay afloat or they don't. So, yeah. Make sure you don't think of these things as monoliths. Where are we at? All right. Let me erase this for right now. And I guess we'll just kind of go through what it looks like when you write an economic advantage or an economic disad. So let's think of a plan text for something. We had one. What did we have this morning? Oh, the coup. That's not a good one for that. Yesterday's resolution, the reduced dependency on foreign oil. Let's go ahead and say that the resolution is the United States federal government will ban imports from Venezuela. No, that's a terrible idea. At least this doesn't help me with the econ stuff. Let's just do something like the U.S. federal government should reject the Keystone Pipeline. So you might want to. So in this situation, you're probably going to want to write an econ advantage to hedge against the inevitable econ disad that they're going to run. So in this situation, you would want to think about what are the economic fields that would benefit from rejecting the Keystone Pipeline and why. So let's brainstorm real quick. What are some of those that would be affected by not having the Keystone Pipeline? Who would benefit from that?
Agriculture.
Alternative energy, certainly. They would benefit because there would, why would alternative energy benefit?
Because fracking is the number one thing we use to decrease our foreign oil dependency.
Right, and which is, think about that in like broadly, can anyone broadly explain why killing the Keystone Pipeline would help alternative energy research? Yeah.
Because currently, if we have a continuous supply of oil, there's no incentive to transition to alternate form of energy because oil will always be cheaper.
Yeah, in essence, there is always a demand for energy. So, the simple answer is, if there is a lack of ability for this energy to access consumers, it only makes it more likely that this type of energy becomes accessible to consumers. And then you have more specific reasons as to why that's true. Oh, absolutely. What besides alternative energy would benefit? Agriculture? Why would agriculture benefit?
Because the Keystone Pipeline runs through a lot of fresh water.
Mhm.
It's a source of water for agriculture.
Right, so the environmental effects. So agriculture firms, and particularly probably smaller, in this situation, you would probably want to run a smaller agriculture disad, because those are the ones that are going to be really threatened by loss of water, because big farms have insulation, they have access to subsidies, they have cash on hand, they have international businesses that they can rely on. Small farms, family-owned farms, like things like that, they're the ones that are really under threat from a bad year, from a major oil spill. So this advantage doesn't even have to be agriculture. This advantage can just be small agriculture firms. Here's why small agriculture firms are under threat from the Keystone Pipeline and the status quo. Here is why that is bad. Solvency, any of the Keystone Pipeline probably makes them feel a little bit better, probably allows them to expand, which is critical for their survival, but also probably makes it easier for them to get loans because they're less of a risk to the bank. It just increases their confidence. Here's why having them around is important. Here's how much food they produce. Here is the amount of labor they hire. Here's why that's important. Here is the nutritional quality in relation to the nutritional quality of large farms. Now you've got three relatively large impacts of nutrition, which is a pretty sweet impact to go for. Then you've got an econ impact off that, obviously, from people keeping jobs. And you probably have an environmental impact because they probably use less pesticides or are more likely to be organic than some of these larger farms. That make sense? What else would be beneficial? What else would be benefited by the ending of the Keystone Pipeline?
Tourism, maybe.
Yeah, you can make that. Although no one's going to visit Kansas anyways. What else?
I mean, I would automatically assume like shipping or the trucking
Yeah, I was
industry,
just gonna say that.
because I mean, if the pipeline doesn't exist, doesn't necessarily mean they can't frack. It just means they can't ship it through this pipeline. So we might think they're
Yeah.
not going to drive it.
They could drive. So yeah, you can make that argument. The way I was going was it helps domestic oil drilling. Like in a world where people still need oil because the transition is nowhere near complete, nor is it even like close, and you stop having the need or the ability to increase your your imports, the logical conclusion is that there will now be an increased call or increased pressure, certainly, to move for domestic oil drilling. So you could write an econ advantage that talks about domestic oil drillers. I don't know if you want to, but you could. And you can have that ready and raring to go. And that is the type of advantage, though, that may make you seem dirty, but it's the kind of advantage that 100% competes with their disadvantage. Because whatever disadvantage they read, either it's going to be some kind of politics disad that talks about the GOP, your instant answer is domestic drilling, bro. Like, we got that, like, their slogan in 2008 was drill baby drill. Like, we're set for this. Like, we've got a good link term for that. Or if their argument is some sort of econ impact, you've got a domestic drilling answer. It's similar fields. It certainly has transitional skills for their labor. it's a type of advantage that you could read that maybe feels a little naughty to run. Like you're like, damn it, I'm ending the Keystone Pipeline to make an argument for more domestic oil drilling. But it's the kind of argument that steals all of the off ground. And stealing all of the off ground is fun and a really good way to win. If you can topically steal the off's ground, you're in a good place. It's a really good when everything they came in to say you just said, but that's important for us, the other team, they're in trouble. Like it's bad news bears if that happens to you. So that's kind of the way that you work through this type of situation, is that you kind of generally think about what sectors of the economy or what areas of the economy are going to be benefited from this action. You think about why they're going to be benefited, how directly the linkage is, and all of these probably have some indirect linkage, so it's a question of strength. And then what are the relative impacts, and what are the relative disadvantages to doing this type of thing? Like reading the domestic oil probably has more access to disads than the other ones, but it also has a benefit of being able to steal the opposition ground. So it's just kind of where you feel on risk taking at that point in terms of articulating which disads you want to go for. This one is probably a bigger stick impact that is a little bit more difficult to get to, just because there's a lot of built-in defense to alternative energy, and the direct line you have to draw from these two is a little muddled. This one is probably quite likely. It's probably very easy for you to point directly to this. The problem is it is also subsequently subject to quite a bit of other pretty good defense, like, I don't know, climate change probably is a really good reason why agriculture firms are inevitably fucked. So, and then you've got the domestic oil drilling, which probably has a really good linkage to it, especially if you consider the way Obama and his administration thinks about the environment. They are very much, you get one, we get one. The best example was when we originally rejected the Keystone Pipeline, we built the southern section. You all know that, right? That we built half the Keystone Pipeline already. Or it's in progress. So we rejected it except for one part of it. Just like when we put regulations on drilling, we also subsequently resold a bunch of federal land on the cheap to oil and gas companies. So like that's his MO. So you can make a really good argument for why you'd see more domestic drilling. Not only that, he's increased domestic drilling, but that's another whole other question. So you have a domestic drilling impact. That is probably a pretty good link. It's got a nice benefit of that you steal the opposition's ground, but it's got a drawback to of environmental questions. So it just becomes a question of where you want to go with that. I'd probably go with agriculture because it's pretty good. It gives you some insulation against answers to disads, and and I also think that you can diversify the impacts to a level that probably gets you a little bit more than others. But that was just me. Yeah.
How do you go about making sure that your economy impacts outweigh their environmental impacts?
Well, that is on a that's more of a question of time frame. But there's also remember the impacts are interconnected, just like everything in debate is interconnected. So the way that you would answer that is you would answer that by making most of your other capitalism good turns, which is anytime you have an increase of any economic increase is necessarily good because it frees up more capital, and freed up capital gets invested. And the only way you can make technological advancements that can allow for monumental environmental changes is through that type of investment. So we have to save the economy because only that allows us for really, really important types of technological developments like alternative energy, carbon capture, anything like that. Nuclear power. I know a lot of people won't like nuclear power, but if you got it good, it's a real good weapon against climate change. No emissions.
Nuclear waste.
Not always. And we can just blast that shit into space.
Send it to Canada.
I have no problem blasting it into space.
No, they were so.
Putting it on a
Space
satellite,
Wars.
just sending it out.
Straight to the sun.
Fuck that, straight to out of our atmosphere, out of our galaxy. Voyager won that shit. We're just gonna send it. We're just gonna literally jettison our trash.
Someday it just comes up.
You know how much power stations like
Space
Yeah,
colonialism
fair
is
enough.
science.
It's pretty bad to be honest too. But it would be bad.
Does that piss off the aliens?
And there's other types of technology that don't require nearly as much fuel and that recycle fuel.
And
Sure.
they just invented like this new way of splitting atoms that's
Mhm.
not dependent on water. So that's kind of awesome.
It is pretty awesome. I'm a big fan of nuclear power, but that's just me. So outside of writing the advantage, there is writing the disadvantage, and writing the disadvantage happens in a very similar way. When you get a resolution, you have to think about what are the potential plan texts and where could they affect, and so you have to think of this type of situation. So if you were on the opposition, what is the disad you could run here?
Politics.
Okay, Econ disad. Because that's true. Econ disad. What?
Plastics industry.
Plastics industry. Yeah. So you all realize that plastics requires anything that runs on petroleum is going to need that. So you could read a plastics disad. You could talk about how the increased cost of petroleum is hampering the plastic industry, and here's why that's bad. Because plastic, if you have increased plastic, you probably have the increased cost of everything else because almost everything else is in plastic. Yeah. Shipping, yeah, absolutely. The shipping industry, wait, why would that be a disad?
Because they would be affected by the increased cost of oil.
Why would they, I suppose, I think that they'd also be stoked though, because they could then ship their oil.
But not,
Probably not the tar sands.
Like domestic mail shipping would be an effective disad, right? Like because like consistently the post office has been in this like massive increase for their attempt to like redo pricing for the mail, but it's not reforming
Okay, I
letter
see what
shipping,
you're
they're only reforming package parcel
saying.
shipping.
So just the cost of transportation increase. Okay, I see what you're saying, yeah. So yeah, certainly a disad that deals with the cost of transportation increasing. What else? What about maybe not a sector based like a shipping or plastics, but what else could be affected? What would building the Keystone Pipeline do?
Great jobs.
What? Great jobs. You can have a hiring disad. Who would get hired by the Keystone Pipeline? What? Construction workers. Yeah. So now you can have a construction hiring disad. Why is construction hiring important? What is the level of construction hiring now? What does that mean for investors, and how are they looking at construction in the near future? Does that mean that that there must be increased construction hiring to save some industries? That's a type of disad that you can talk about. What else? Are there any other major disads you could run from this that deal with economics? If we'd rejected the Keystone Pipeline, what country would be kind of mad? Who's our number one trading partner? Okay. So, now take a situation where you have trade relations between Canada. What are the trade relations between Canada? That's a question you would answer. And now what would be the effect of rejecting the Keystone Pipeline, frankly, after you've already said you're going to accept it? What would be the effects on trade between the United States and Canada? That's an economics disad that you can think of. So you can think of these questions in a whole bunch of different ways, and then you brainstorm out the connections between the two and subsequently pick your favorite. Do you have anything? Okay. I think I have like another 10, 15 minutes left in me. So I'm gonna go ahead and just open it up for some questions and see if people have any questions about debating the economy or understanding it, where we can go from there. Yeah?
Do you wanna talk about like, economics in terms of like international trade and stuff, currencies?
I was gonna, I have a lecture later on called Global Economic Issues that is gonna dive into that, so.
Alright, well,
And I want to talk about that, but I would ruin my lecture. Yeah.
Can we talk about what actually would collapse the economy?
Well, there are the obvious ones, like, massive oil price spikes would be pretty bad. But again, you have to understand, collapse is a weird term because economies don't collapse just instantaneously. There is a whole international system to prop important economies up. So,
Right, like, can we talk about just those impacts of like economic collapse?
so when if some country experienced a major economic downturn, and a great example of this would be the 2007 housing collapse. I mean, there were massive places that experienced huge economic downturns. What you see is you tend to see a marked increase in the amount of poverty, because much more people put into poverty. So anytime there is a global economic downturn, there is a poverty impact to be had. You also tend to see an increase of violence in states whose economies crumble, and these tend to be states on the peripheries. This is why you see one of the major reasons why you see increased violence in Africa and the Middle East. Yes, it is a question of democracy, but it's also a question of pricing. I mean, one of the major reasons why things in Tunisia happened was because there was just a lack of food. And there was so much government corruption that that surrounded that problem, that it became untenable. Same with Egypt. One of the reasons that people weren't particularly stoked on why people uprose in Egypt initially was they cut subsidies for the poor. I mean, Brazil during the World Cup, during the Confederations Cup in July, they had huge protests that were originally sparked by raising bus fares. So you see these types of things happen from economic decisions that get made because of economic downturns, and they are certainly compounded by the severity of the economic downturn. The other impact that you have is much more of a long-term impact, but it's generally just a lack of economic growth tends to precipitate a collapse. There just tends to be stagnation, and that has a whole bunch of other problems, but those problems are very latent. They're very much underneath the surface and you don't see them. These are things like suicides. People who have a tough time rebounding from an economic collapse. This is why you see increased suicides around after economic collapses. People lose everything and they kill themselves, and it's very sad. Subsequently, there's also a pretty sweet impact turn that says you have less divorce, actually, after economic collapse, because it becomes too expensive to divorce. So, economic collapse leads to better marriages? I don't know. I wouldn't say better, I would just say being stuck in marriage. I don't know. I suppose you have a divorce lawyer's impact there. But they probably are just fine. Yeah, so there's not like any economic sector, any economic collapse, you certainly have the increased likelihood, you certainly have increased poverty, you certainly have the increased likelihood for conflict. The problem is that outside something that is just catastrophic, there is so much, first off, there's just so much international systems that allows it to keep up, but also we are just like this close away from just like ending the problem anyways. Like if a country is under a massive amount of debt, we can just do this thing called not thinking about it anymore, and it goes away. We do that all the time. Like, the United States has, every once in a while, Mexico's economy will crash, and we'll send them like $900 million, and they won't really get that $900 million, they just have $900 million that they can use to borrow again. So we in essence, it's we just all, like, everyone puts a tick mark in their brain, okay, Mexico owes us $900 million that we never actually gave them or never actually existed. It's just this line of credit, and that's enough. So, like, econ downturns, they get solved real fast in terms of, like, these large, like, not solved, but certainly stemmed quite quickly. The problem is that the stemming process is what causes all of the harm to the people at the periphery. Because an economic collapse, in terms of relative damage, if there was a true economic collapse, the relative damage would be way on the hands of the elites. Like, they would suffer significantly more from a total economic collapse than those at the middle or the bottom. So, the elites are always going to find a way to keep themselves in power any time there's a collapse. So you don't have to worry about these massive states versus state conflicts, because that's going to require the elites to not be around. And if they're not around, then it may not be the worst thing.
I have a question.
What? Yeah.
Could you like kind of comment as to like how the economy works like as far as education prices go, like higher education? Because I know that like interest rates just went up, and we might see something about that.
So that's an interest rate that's set by Congress. So that's actually outside, because Congress tends to do things with their own economic interpretation. So the rate that it got doubled to, I think, is 6.4 or 6.8. 6.8, that's right, it was 3.4. So it just got doubled to 6.8 after it was halved for a few years under a tax. But there's a few arguments for why the cost of college is increasing. The one argument, and this would be more of like a classical conservative economic interpretation, is that there is too much access to cheap loans, that there is no incentive, that schools are only incentivized to raise their prices because everybody can get money. There is a glut of ability to raise your prices because there's just so many people that are coming to you. That's easy. That is one interpretation. The other is that there is just an increasing amount of increased cost placed on the universities in the face of an economic downturn, because one of the main ways that a lot of universities fund themselves is through endowments. Those are drying up relatively quickly, and for a lot of schools have dried up almost entirely, which means you have to raise tuition. The other argument is that it, just like medical inflation, is such a important skill, or so imperative in our economy, that they can justify increasing the price for that even at an inordinate, even at lower demand, because the argument is you have to go to college to get a good job, which means as long as that narrative exists, they're able to perpetually justify increasing costs. Yeah.
Do you know if there's a correlation between increasing cost and decreasing going to school?
There may be a correlation. Now, I don't know of any particular causation of that. I'm not sure. I haven't read anything about that, but there very well could be. There very well could be a correlation, but I don't know about the causation of that. It depends. It probably also depends on what region you're in, because some regions during economic downturns experience some growth because it's the type of jobs that are being created. Other questions? Nothing? All right. Well, I'm done.